A chance encounter. Dr. Emmanuel Carter walked down the quiet streets of his suburban neighborhood, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Another grueling shift at the hospital had drained him, both physically and emotionally. The sky above was painted in hues of orange and pink, the last light of day stretching thin across the horizon. He barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of a time when coming home had meant laughter, warmth, and love. Melissa. Her name echoed in his heart like a song he had once known but could no longer sing. It had been nearly 4 years since he lost her to cancer, but the ache never truly faded. The house they had bought together, the life they had built, everything felt hollow without her. There was no one waiting for him at home, no one to share the details of his day, no one to remind him that there was still beauty in the world. His steps slowed as he turned a familiar corner, where a small bakery stood. Melissa used to love their almond croissants, often making him detour on his way home just to pick one up. He sighed, forcing the thought away. He didn't need another reminder of what he had lost. Then he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it, a muffled cry. He stopped mid-step, his ears straining. Was he imagining it? The street was nearly deserted, only the distant hum of traffic from the main road disturbing the silence. And then, there it was again, a soft, stifled sob, coming from the narrow alley between the bakery and the adjacent building. A surge of concern propelled him forward. He stepped into the dimly lit alley, his heart already pounding. There, curled up against the cold brick wall, was a little girl. She looked no older than 5, her small frame wrapped in oversized, tattered clothes. Her dark, tightly curled hair was messy, tangled in knots, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She was shivering, her tiny arms wrapped around herself as she tried to disappear into the shadows. Dr. Emmanuel's breath caught in his throat. "Hey there," he said gently, careful not to startle her. "Are you okay?" The girl flinched, shrinking back against the wall, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto his. She didn't answer. Instead, she hugged her knees tighter, pressing her forehead against them as if she could will herself to vanish. His heart clenched. Something was very wrong. "It's okay," he tried again, kneeling so he wasn't towering over her. "I'm a doctor. I just want to help." She shook her head violently, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. Then she whispered something. Soft, rapid, unintelligible. Not English. He frowned, trying to place the language. It wasn't Spanish. Portuguese, maybe. French? He wasn't sure. But what was a child, alone and clearly in distress, doing here in an alley, speaking a language he couldn't understand? "Do you speak English?" he asked softly. She didn't answer. She just stared at him with those big, frightened eyes. Dr. Emmanuel exhaled, thinking fast. He couldn't leave her here. The night air was getting colder, and she was already shivering. Where were her parents? Had she gotten lost? Was she abandoned? The thought made his stomach twist. "Listen," he said, his voice as calm as he could make it. "You can't stay out here all night. It's too cold. I have a warm house nearby, with food and a soft bed. You don't have to be afraid." She didn't move. His mind raced. He could call the police. He probably should. But something in him resisted. He had seen the way she had flinched at his voice, the way she instinctively recoiled, as if expecting harm. Someone had hurt this child before. He was sure of it. He reached out slowly, offering his hand. "Come with me," he said softly. "I'll take care of you." The girl hesitated, her small fingers twitching. A long, tense moment passed. Then, slowly, so slowly, she reached out and placed her trembling hand in his. Dr. Emmanuel felt something inside him crack wide open. Bringing her home. He carried her home in silence, his arms carefully wrapped around her tiny frame. She was so light. Too light. Malnourished, perhaps. His house wasn't much, a modest 2-story home. neatly kept but largely untouched since Melissa's passing. It still had her presence in little ways. The framed pictures on the walls, the floral curtains she had insisted on, the half-read books she had left by the fireplace. He pushed the thoughts aside and gently set the girl down in the foyer. She looked around warily, her posture stiff with uncertainty. "It's okay," he reassured her. "You're safe here." She just stared at him. "Are you hungry?" he asked, miming eating with his hands. She hesitated, then nodded, just barely. Relieved, he led her to the kitchen. He quickly put together something simple: warm soup, soft bread, a glass of water. As he set the food in front of her, she eyed it with a hunger so intense it made his chest ache. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "Eat." She hesitated just a moment longer before diving in, shoveling food into her mouth so quickly he had to reach out to slow her down. "It's okay," he said softly. "Take your time." As she ate, he took the moment to study her more closely. Her hands were small, but there were faint scars on her wrists, old wounds, healed but still visible. Her bare feet were dirty, scraped. Her clothes were ragged, too thin for the season. Who had let her end up like this? After she finished, he led her to the bathroom. "Let's get you cleaned up," he said, turning on the warm water and miming washing his face. To his surprise, she complied. She let him help her wash her hands and face, though she flinched slightly when he combed through her tangled curls. Afterward, he found one of Melissa's old oversized t-shirts for her to wear. It hung off her tiny frame, making her look even smaller. Finally, he led her to the guest room. "You can sleep here," he said, tucking the blankets around her. "You're safe." She clutched the edge of the covers, her dark eyes searching his face. As he turned to leave, he felt a small tug on his sleeve. He looked down. The girl, this lost, frightened child, was silently pleading with him. Not with words, just a single desperate look. "Stay." Something inside him broke. Without hesitation, he sat beside her, letting her hold onto his hand as she drifted off to sleep. As he watched her tiny chest rise and fall, a thought surfaced, one he hadn't dared to consider before. Maybe this wasn't just about saving her. Maybe she was saving him too. A silent bond. Dr. Emmanuel Carter woke up earlier than usual. The house was still blanketed in quiet, the soft hum of the heater the only sound breaking the silence. He rubbed his tired eyes and sat up, momentarily disoriented. Then he remembered. The girl. He turned toward the guest room, his chest tightening with worry. Had she slept through the night? Had she tried to leave? He had never cared for a child before, especially one who had been through something traumatic. He stepped toward the door and slowly pushed it open. The small figure was still there, curled up beneath the thick blankets. The oversized t-shirt he had given her practically swallowed her tiny frame. But what truly struck him was her stillness. She slept as if she had never felt safe before, her little body tense even in rest. Her face, though peaceful now, was still marked with the remnants of exhaustion. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her. He hadn't planned for this. He was a doctor, not a father. He knew how to mend broken bones, how to stitch up wounds, how to bring a patient back from the brink. But this was something else entirely. He exhaled and turned toward the kitchen. She would need breakfast when she woke up. A name without words. The smell of scrambled eggs and toast filled the kitchen by the time the girl appeared in the doorway. She stood there hesitantly, her bare feet barely making a sound against the wooden floor. Her dark eyes flickered between him and the food, cautious but undeniably curious. "Good morning," he greeted, offering a smile. She didn't respond. Instead, she inched closer, her gaze locked onto the plate of food on the table. "Come sit," he said, pulling out a chair for her. She hesitated but eventually obeyed, climbing into the seat and sitting stiffly. He set a plate in front of her, placing the fork within reach. At first, she just stared at the food. Then, as if she was afraid it might disappear, she grabbed the fork and started eating. Dr. Emmanuel watched carefully. She wasn't as frantic as the night before, but she still ate quickly, as though she wasn't used to having a full meal in front of her. He didn't speak for a moment, unsure of how to begin. Then he pointed to himself. "Emmanuel," he said slowly. She looked up, confused. He repeated the gesture. "Emmanuel." A long pause. Then, slowly, cautiously, she lifted her small hand and pointed at him. "Eman," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Something in his chest clenched. It was the first word she had spoken in his presence. "That's right," he said gently. "Emmanuel." He then pointed at her, his eyebrows raised in question. She hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she shook her head. His heart sank. She didn't have a name. Or had she just forgotten it? His mind raced with possibilities. Was she suffering from memory loss? Or had she been told not to speak her name? Regardless, she needed something to be called. He thought for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Joy." Her eyes widened slightly. "It means happiness," he explained, even though he knew she might not understand. "Something beautiful. Something special." She stared at him, unmoving. Then, slowly, so slowly, her lips parted. "Joy," she whispered. And just like that, she had a name. First steps toward healing. Later that day, Dr. Emmanuel found himself staring at his phone, debating what to do. The rational part of him knew he had to contact social services. He couldn't just keep Joy without reporting her situation. But another part of him, a part he hadn't felt in years, didn't want to risk losing her. He had spent so long drowning in grief, in loneliness. And now, this little girl had entered his life like a whisper of fate. Would they take her away? Would they send her somewhere unfamiliar? Somewhere worse? His grip tightened on the phone. He couldn't take that risk. But he could get help another way. His fingers dialed a different number. "Hello, this is Dr. Jonah Chen." Dr. Emmanuel let out a slow breath. "Jonah, it's Emmanuel. I need your help." A difficult conversation. Dr. Joanna Chen had been a friend and colleague for years. A child psychologist, she had helped countless children work through trauma. If anyone could guide him through this, it was her. 30 minutes later, she was sitting across from him in his living room, her sharp eyes scanning Joy as the little girl sat curled up in an armchair. "She's not talking much, huh?" Jonah murmured, keeping her voice gentle. Dr. Emmanuel shook his head. "Just a couple of words. She understood when I gave her the name Joy, though. I don't think she's completely nonverbal. She just doesn't trust me yet." Jonah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Children who go through trauma often shut down verbally," she explained. "It's a defense mechanism. Some are too scared to speak. Others have been punished for speaking in the past. And if she doesn't speak English fluently, that's another barrier." Dr. Emmanuel clenched his jaw. "She flinched when I reached for her last night. Someone hurt her." Jonah sighed. "It's possible. But without knowing her story, we can't make assumptions." She turned toward Joy, offering a warm smile. "Hi, sweetheart. My name is Jonah." Joy stared but didn't respond. Jonah didn't seem fazed. Instead, she pulled a small notebook from her bag and a handful of colorful markers. "I thought we could draw together," she said, sliding the notebook toward Joy. "Would you like that?" Joy's gaze flickered to the markers. Then, ever so cautiously, she reached forward and took one. Dr. Emmanuel held his breath as she pressed the marker to the page. She began to draw. At first it was just shaky lines, hesitant strokes of color. But then, slowly, an image began to take shape. A house, a small figure, a larger figure beside it. Dr. Emmanuel's breath caught in his throat. "That's beautiful," Jonah said softly. "Is that you?" Joy hesitated, then nodded. Jonah smiled gently. "And who's this?" She pointed to the taller figure. Joy paused. Then, gripping the marker tightly, she wrote something underneath the drawing. A single, wobbly word. "Eman." Dr. Emmanuel felt his heart stop. He hadn't realized how much he needed to see that. Joanna glanced at him, then back at Joy. "You're safe now," she whispered to the little girl. "No one's going to hurt you here." Joy said nothing, but she reached for another marker. And for the first time since he found her, she smiled. When the walls began to crumble, the soft sound of pencil scratches filled the quiet living room. Joy sat cross-legged on the rug, a small stack of papers spread before her. She gripped a blue crayon tightly in her tiny fingers, lost in concentration. Dr. Emmanuel sat across from her, pretending to read through medical journals, but his focus was elsewhere. He watched her, each small movement, every glance. Since the visit from Dr. Joanna Chen 2 days ago, Joy had started drawing more and more. It was the only way she seemed to communicate. She still spoke very little, mostly simple words like yes, no, and amen. But the drawings, they spoke volumes. Most were simple pictures, flowers, stars, houses, but every now and then a darker image would appear. Figures with no faces, a door with a heavy lock, a hand reaching through a fence. Each time she drew something unsettling, she would glance at Dr. Emmanuel, gauging his reaction, as if she wasn't sure if she was allowed to remember. And he let her take her time. He wasn't going to push her. He had no idea what kind of past she carried, but he knew one thing. Joy needed to feel safe before she could open up. And so he watched. He waited. And he prayed that when she was ready, he would be able to handle the truth. A trip to the market. It started with a simple idea: fresh air, a little normalcy. Dr. Emmanuel had been hesitant to take Joy out into public too soon, but she had been growing more comfortable at home. Maybe it was time. So on a crisp Saturday morning, he bundled her up in a warm sweater and took her to the local farmer's market. At first, she stayed glued to his side, her small hand gripping his coat tightly. Her eyes darted from stall to stall, wary of the bustling crowd. But as they walked, something shifted. She started to notice the bright colors of fresh fruit, the way children her age ran ahead of their parents, laughing, the scent of baked bread drifting through the air. And for the first time, she let go of his hand, just for a moment. She wandered toward a flower stand, her fingers lightly brushing against the petals of a sunflower. The vendor, an elderly woman with soft eyes, smiled down at her. "You like sunflowers, sweetheart?" Joy hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Dr. Emmanuel's heart clenched. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary interaction. But for Joy, it was a step forward. He stepped up beside her and handed the vendor a few bills. "We'll take one," he said, smiling down at Joy. "For you." Her eyes widened as the woman handed her the sunflower. She clutched it gently, staring at the golden petals as if she had never held something so delicate before. Then, without a word, she reached up and placed it in Dr. Emmanuel's hand. A gift. He swallowed hard, blinking against the unexpected rush of emotion. "Thank you, Joy," he murmured. She didn't say anything. But for the first time since she had entered his life, she slipped her small fingers back into his hand, not out of fear, but because she wanted to. The nightmares begin. That night, the screaming started. Dr. Emmanuel jolted awake, his heart hammering in his chest. It took him a moment to register where he was. And then, Joy's voice, high-pitched, desperate. He scrambled out of bed and rushed to the guest room. She was thrashing in her sleep, her tiny hands clawing at the blankets, her face twisted in terror. "No," she whimpered, her voice thick with panic. "No, no, no." Dr. Emmanuel dropped to his knees beside the bed. "Joy," he said softly, touching her arm. "It's okay. You're safe." She jerked awake, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her wide, terrified eyes darted around the room. She wasn't here. She was still there, wherever there was. Dr. Emmanuel felt helpless. He reached for her, but she flinched away, curling into herself. His heart broke. He didn't know what to do. So he did the only thing that made sense. He sat beside her, his voice low and steady. "You're safe, Joy. It was just a dream. No one is going to hurt you here." It took several long minutes, but eventually her breathing slowed. The panic faded from her eyes. And then something unexpected happened. She reached for him, just barely. A small hand, hesitant and trembling, brushing against his sleeve. He didn't move. He let her come to him at her own pace. And when she finally gripped his hand, so tightly it almost hurt, he knew. This wasn't just fear. This was survival. Something had happened to her, something dark. And whatever it wasn't over. Not in her mind, not in her heart. Not yet. A visit to Dr. Chen. The next morning, Dr. Emmanuel made a decision. Joy needed professional help. He couldn't do this alone. By the time they arrived at Dr. Joanna Chen's office, Joy was back to her silent, wary self. She clung to his coat, refusing to let go. Dr. Chen smiled gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Would you like to draw again?" Joy hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she let go of Dr. Emmanuel and took the offered crayons. As she drew, Dr. Chen spoke in hushed tones with Dr. Emmanuel. "The nightmares are a sign that she's beginning to process her trauma," she explained. "But she's still holding back. We need to be patient." Dr. Emmanuel nodded, though his heart ached. He wanted to fix this. He wanted to take her pain away. But this wasn't a wound he could stitch up. This was deeper, more invisible. "She trusts you," Dr. Chen continued. "That's the most important thing. When she's ready, she'll tell you her story." Dr. Emmanuel glanced at Joy. She was drawing again. But this time, the image was different. A door. And behind it, a shadowy figure. His stomach twisted. Was this a memory? Or a warning? The phone call that changed everything. That evening, as Joy sat on the couch flipping through a picture book, Dr. Emmanuel's phone rang. Unknown number. He frowned but answered. "Hello." There was a pause. Then, a woman's voice. Tired, raspy, and filled with something that made his blood run cold. "You have my daughter." Dr. Emmanuel's breath caught. Every muscle in his body tensed. The voice continued, low and unsteady. "You don't understand. She's in danger." The line went dead. Dr. Emmanuel stood frozen, his mind racing. Who was that? What did she mean, danger? Slowly, he turned. Joy was staring at him, her small hands clenched into fists. She had heard. And for the first time, real fear flickered across her face. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Shadows of the past. The room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Dr. Emmanuel Carter stood frozen, his phone still clenched tightly in his hand. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he replayed the chilling words. "You have my daughter. She's in danger." The voice on the other end had been urgent, strained, as if the woman was on the edge of breaking. But before he could ask anything, the line had gone dead. Who was she? And what did she mean, danger? A slow chill crept down his spine. Across the room, Joy sat stiffly on the couch, her small hands gripping the edge of the cushion. She had heard. He could see it in the way she held herself, tense, on guard, as if bracing for something terrible. Dr. Emmanuel took a deep breath and forced his hands to relax. He couldn't let her see his fear. "Joy," he said carefully, kneeling in front of her. "Do you know who that was?" She didn't answer right away, but her lip trembled. Slowly, she nodded. His stomach nodded. "Is she your mother?" Joy's fingers curled into her sweater. Then, in a voice so small it was almost lost to the air, she whispered, "No." Dr. Emmanuel frowned. "Then who is she?" Joy swallowed hard. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. But then she shook her head and turned away, pressing her face into her knees. She wasn't ready to talk. Dr. Emmanuel exhaled. Pushing her wouldn't help. But that call had changed everything. Someone out there knew Joy. Someone out there wanted her back. And if Joy's reaction was anything to go by, that wasn't a good thing. An unexpected revelation. The next morning, Dr. Emmanuel sat in his study, his mind a tangled mess of questions. He had spent the night tossing and turning, trying to piece things together. The voice on the phone had been distressed, frantic, almost. But what truly unsettled him was her warning. She's in danger. He needed answers. With a sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in a long time. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This is Detective Mark Reynolds." Dr. Emmanuel exhaled. "Mark, it's me, Emmanuel." There was a brief pause, then a low chuckle. Well, haven't heard from you in a while. Doc, what's going on?" Dr. Emmanuel hesitated. How much could he say without putting Joy at risk? "I need your help with something," he said carefully. "It's about a little girl." Silence stretched across the line. Then Mark's voice dropped, all humor gone. "You in trouble, Doc?" Dr. Emmanuel rubbed a hand down his face. "I don't know yet, but someone called me last night. A woman. She said I had her daughter." Mark let out a slow breath. "You think she's legit?" "That's the thing," Dr. Emmanuel muttered. "Joy doesn't seem to recognize her as her mother. And when I asked her about it, she shut down completely." Mark made a thoughtful sound. "All right, give me what you got. We can run a trace on the call, see where it came from." Dr. Emmanuel nodded, even though Mark couldn't see him. "I'll send you the number." "Good. And, Emmanuel." "Yeah." Mark hesitated. "If this kid is involved in something dangerous, you need to be prepared for the worst. People don't just lose children like this. Someone's going to come looking." Dr. Emmanuel's grip tightened around the phone. That was what he was afraid of. A broken memory. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Joy barely touched her food. She kept glancing at the front door, her small hands clenching her fork with quiet tension. Dr. Emmanuel set his own fork down. "Joy," he said softly, "I need you to trust me. If something is wrong, you can tell me." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, her little hands began to tremble. Slowly, she pushed her plate away and reached for the sketchbook that Dr. Joanna Chen had given her. Dr. Emmanuel watched as she picked up a crayon, black this time, and started drawing. Her strokes were hurried, uneven. Then, when she was done, she slid the paper across the table. Dr. Emmanuel's breath caught. The drawing showed a room. A dark room. A child. Small, huddled in a corner. And outside the door, a shadowed figure with no face. Dr. Emmanuel's throat tightened. "Joy," he said gently. "Is this a memory?" She didn't answer. But she didn't have to. Her shaking hands told him everything. A stranger at the door. Later that night, long after Joy had fallen asleep, Dr. Emmanuel sat in the dim glow of his study. His mind was spinning. The drawings, the nightmares, the phone call. Something dark was chasing Joy. And now, he was a part of it. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. His heart leaped into his throat. Slowly, he stood, his body tense. It was nearly midnight. No one should be here. He moved toward the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A woman stood outside. She was thin, her dark hair tied into a loose bun, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. But when she shifted slightly under the porch light, Dr. Emmanuel saw something that made his stomach drop. Bruises. Deep ones, barely hidden under the collar of her worn sweater. She knocked again, softer this time. "Dr. Carter." Her voice was the same one from the phone call. "Please, I need to talk to you." Dr. Emmanuel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to be careful. But then, a quiet, trembling voice behind him. "Amen." He turned. Joy stood at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with recognition. Dr. Emmanuel's chest tightened. "Joy," he said slowly. "Do you know this woman?" Joy didn't answer, but she took a shaky step forward and whispered a name that made the air leave his lungs. "Lena." The woman on the porch stiffened. Dr. Emmanuel's heart pounded. This wasn't her mother, but she knew Joy, and that could change everything. The truth in shadows. Dr. Emmanuel's fingers hovered over the door handle, his mind racing. Joy had spoken, not just a word, a name. Lena. It was the first time she had voluntarily offered information about her past, but the way she had said it, hesitant, uncertain, told him that the truth wasn't simple. Outside, the woman's breath hitched. She took a step closer to the door, her hands trembling. "Joy," she whispered, barely audible through the wooden frame. "You remember me?" Joy remained frozen on the staircase, her small fingers curled around the railing. Her dark eyes darted between Dr. Emmanuel and the door. Finally, she nodded. A slow exhale left Lena's lips, as if she had been holding her breath for years. "Please," she begged, her voice hoarse. "Let me in. I need to explain." Dr. Emmanuel didn't move. Every instinct told him to be cautious. Lena looked desperate, broken, but he had no way of knowing if she was safe. Still, Joy knew her, and that changed everything. He took a steadying breath, then turned the lock and opened the door, just enough to see her fully but not enough for her to enter. Up close, she was even thinner than he had thought. Her hollow cheeks and dark circled eyes spoke of sleepless nights, of fear that had aged her far too quickly. But it was the bruises on her neck that made his stomach turn. Someone had hurt her, and recently. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Lena swallowed, stealing a glance at Joy before answering. "My name is Lena Torres," she said, "and I know where Joy came from." Dr. Emmanuel's grip tightened on the doorframe. "Keep talking." Lena's breath shuddered. "Not here. Not outside. Please, I don't know who might be watching." She glanced over her shoulder as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. Dr. Emmanuel hesitated. Then he turned to Joy. "Do you want me to let her in?" he asked softly. Joy stared at Lena for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. That was all he needed. With a quiet sigh, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. The unspoken past. Lena sank onto the couch, her entire body tense, as if she expected to be dragged away at any moment. Dr. Emmanuel sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Joy remained by the stairs, not quite ready to come closer but unwilling to leave. Lena let out a shaky breath. "I don't know how much she remembers," she started, rubbing her hands together. "But I'll tell you everything I can." Dr. Emmanuel leaned forward. "I'm listening." Lena swallowed hard, her gaze flickering to Joy before she continued. "I worked for them," she said. "That's how I found Joy." Dr. Emmanuel frowned. "Them?" Lena nodded, her jaw tightening. "A group. People who take children." His blood ran cold. "Human trafficking?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena flinched at the words but nodded. Dr. Emmanuel felt the floor tilt beneath him. The bruises, the nightmares, the drawings. It all made sense now. Joy hadn't just been lost. She had escaped. Lena clenched her fists. "I was never one of them," she said quickly, desperation leaking into her voice. "I was trapped too. I worked as a cleaner for their safe houses, but I saw things. Terrible things." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. "One day, I saw Joy locked in a room. She was so small, so silent. She never spoke, never cried, just sat there, staring at the door." Dr. Emmanuel's jaw clenched. "They were waiting to move her," Lena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But something went wrong. The police raided another location, and they panicked. They left the safe house, but they didn't take Joy with them. That was my chance. I took her and ran. Dr. Emmanuel's breath caught. Lena had saved her, but if Joy was still afraid, if she still refused to speak about her past, then it meant, "They came looking for you," he guessed. Lena nodded, her body trembling. "I was hiding for months, moving from place to place, but they found me. I barely got away, and that's when I lost Joy." She turned to the little girl, her eyes welling with tears. "I looked for you," she whispered. "I searched everywhere." Joy's small hands trembled at her sides. She took one step forward, then another. Slowly, cautiously, she sat beside Lena on the couch. Lena let out a choked sob and reached for her, then stopped, her hands hovering, waiting for permission. Joy hesitated. Then, slowly, she let Lena touch her hand. Dr. Emmanuel exhaled the breath he had been holding. But one question still burned in his mind. "You said she was in danger," he said, bringing Lena's attention back to him. "What did you mean?" Lena's face darkened. "They're still looking for her," she whispered, "and they won't stop until they find her. A target on their backs." The air in the room turned heavy. Dr. Emmanuel clenched his fists. "They don't know she's here," he said. "Right." Lena hesitated. "I don't think so. Not yet. Not yet." The words chilled him to his core. "Then we need to move fast," he muttered, standing up. Lena looked up at him. "Move." Dr. Emmanuel ran a hand down his face. "I have a friend, a detective. I'll get him involved. If these people are still out there, we need protection." Lena swallowed hard. "That might make things worse. If they find out we went to the palace." "I don't care," Dr. Emmanuel snapped. "I'm not risking Joy's safety." Lena flinched at his tone, but she nodded. Dr. Emmanuel took a deep breath, steadying himself. He turned to Joy. She was staring up at him, her small body tense with fear. But there was something else in her expression, something he hadn't seen before. Trust. She trusted him to keep her safe, and he wasn't about to let her down. He knelt in front of her, his voice softening. "Joy," he said, "we're going to figure this out, okay? You don't have to be afraid anymore." Joy hesitated. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around his neck. Dr. Emmanuel felt his throat tighten. He held her close, his grip firm and protective. He had spent years grieving Melissa, believing that his heart would never feel whole again. But this little girl, this child who had already been through so much, had found her way into his life. And now, she was his. No matter what happened next, no matter who came looking, he wasn't going to let them take her. The hunt begins. The weight of the night settled heavily over Dr. Emmanuel Carter's home. The air inside was thick with tension, a fragile silence stretching between the three of them, Dr. Emmanuel, Joy, and Lena. The truth had finally emerged. Joy hadn't simply been a lost child. She had been taken. And now, the people who had stolen her, the ones who ran the human trafficking ring, were still out there, searching. For her. For Lena. And maybe now for him. Dr. Emmanuel sat on the edge of his couch, his mind running through every possibility, every danger. Lena was curled up in the armchair, her arms wrapped around herself, her breath shaky. Joy sat between them, quiet, her little hands twisting in the fabric of her oversized sweater. She hadn't spoken much since Lena had revealed the truth, but she hadn't let go of Dr. Emmanuel's sleeve either. She was afraid. And for the first time in his life, Dr. Emmanuel felt helpless. A doctor could mend broken bones, could heal wounds, could breathe life back into a dying body. But how did he fight this? How did he stop a faceless, unseen evil from creeping back into Joy's life? He clenched his jaw. He would. Even if he had to move mountains, he would never let them take her again. Calling in reinforcements. Dr. Emmanuel inhaled deeply and stood, grabbing his phone from the coffee table. Mark Reynolds. The detective had told him to be careful. He had warned him that something big was happening. But now it was time to stop guessing. It was time to act. He stepped away from the living room, into his study, and dialed Mark's number. The phone rang once, twice. Then a gruff voice answered. Reynolds. Dr. Emmanuel exhaled. It's me. We have a problem. There was a pause. Then Mark's voice lowered. I figured. The trace came back. Dr. Emmanuel's pulse quickened. And the call was from a burner phone, untraceable beyond the city limits. But get this. Your address was flagged in the system this morning. A sharp chill shot down Dr. Emmanuel's spine. What? Someone's been looking for you, Doc, and not through legal channels. That's bad news. Dr. Emmanuel clenched his jaw. That means they know she's here. Not yet, Mark said, but it won't take long. Dr. Emmanuel's grip tightened on the phone. What do I do? First, Mark said, his tone urgent, you don't stay at your house. If these guys are serious, they'll find you. Get out. Tonight. Dr. Emmanuel's blood turned to ice. Move. Tonight. He turned back toward the living room, where Joy sat curled up, still gripping his sleeve. She had just started feeling safe. And now he had to take her away. But he had to. He had no choice. All right, Dr. Emmanuel said, forcing himself to think clearly. I'll take her somewhere safe. Good, Mark said. I'll run deeper background checks on Lena's story. If these people are organized, we'll need solid evidence before we can get the feds involved. Dr. Emmanuel sighed. Just hurry, Mark. We're running out of time. Mark hesitated. Then his voice softened slightly. You're doing the right thing, Doc. Stay smart. Stay safe. The call ended. Dr. Emmanuel leaned against his desk, gripping the edge tightly. He had to leave. He had to move now, leaving home behind. When he stepped back into the living room, Lena looked up. She had been watching him carefully, her sharp eyes reading the tension in his face. They're coming, aren't they? She asked quietly. Dr. Emmanuel didn't sugarcoat it. We need to leave. Tonight. Lena's breath hitched. Where? Somewhere safe, he said. I have a cabin, about an hour outside the city. No one knows about it. Lena hesitated. Will it be enough? Dr. Emmanuel's jaw tightened. It has to be. He turned to Joy. She was already watching him, her big eyes filled with silent understanding. He crouched in front of her, keeping his voice gentle. Joy, we need to go on a little trip. Okay, he said. It's just for a while. We'll be safe there. Joy hesitated. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. No fear. Just trust. Dr. Emmanuel felt something tighten in his chest. He reached out, brushing a curl from her forehead. You're very brave, you know that, he murmured. Joy's lips pressed together, and for the first time in days, she whispered back. You too. Dr. Emmanuel's breath caught. Then, without another word, he stood. They had to leave. The escape. Dr. Emmanuel moved quickly, packing a single bag for himself and a few clothes for Joy. Lena packed whatever she had with her. 30 minutes later, they were in the car. The city blurred behind them as Dr. Emmanuel drove, the headlights cutting through the dark, empty highway. Joy sat in the back, wrapped in a blanket, staring out the window. Lena sat in the passenger seat, fidgeting anxiously. We'll be safe there, Dr. Emmanuel reassured. No one knows about the place but me. Lena nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Neither was he. The whole drive, he kept checking the rearview mirror. Every car behind them made his pulse spike. But nothing happened. By the time they reached the remote cabin in the woods, the sky had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Dr. Emmanuel pulled into the gravel driveway and killed the engine. Silence. No headlights in the distance, no signs of being followed. They had made it. For now. A fragile piece. The cabin was small but warm. Nestled between towering trees, it was a safe haven from the world. As they stepped inside, Joy looked around, her eyes wide. Lena exhaled, sinking onto the couch. "We'll be okay here," Dr. Emmanuel said, mostly to himself. He knelt beside Joy, brushing her shoulder lightly. "You're safe now," he promised. Joy studied him carefully. Then, to his surprise, she lifted her arms. A silent request. His throat tightened as he lifted her up, holding her close. She buried her face in his shoulder. She didn't need words. She just needed him. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Dr. Emmanuel allowed himself to believe. Maybe they really could outrun the past. But as dawn stretched across the sky, painting the world in gold, a single black SUV rolled to a stop on the empty highway behind them. And inside, someone was watching. Nowhere left to run. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees surrounding the cabin, painting streaks of gold across the wooden floors. Inside, the air was still, filled only with the faint hum of the heater and the distant chirping of birds. For a few fleeting moments, it almost felt safe. Almost. Dr. Emmanuel Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had sent a text to Detective Mark Reynolds an hour ago, but there had been no response. That was a bad sign. Across the room, Joy sat curled up in a blanket on the couch, tracing patterns on the fabric with her small fingers. Lena stood by the window, peeking through the curtains. She was watching. Waiting. For what? They weren't sure. But the feeling in Dr. Emmanuel's gut told him one thing. They weren't alone. A shadow in the forest. Joy shifted on the couch, her small body tense. Lena turned from the window. "I think we should leave." Dr. Emmanuel clenched his jaw. "And go where? We don't even know if we were followed." Lena hesitated. "We can't take that chance. These people, they're organized. If they track you down once, they can do it again." He ran a hand through his hair. "Mark was supposed to check in. If I don't hear from him soon, I'll call again." Lena pressed her lips together but said nothing. Then, a noise, a rustling from the tree line. Lena froze. Dr. Emmanuel's pulse quickened. He stood, moving quietly toward the window. He peered out, scanning the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. Nothing. But his instincts screamed at him. Something was out there. And it was watching. A voice from the past. His phone buzzed. Dr. Emmanuel snatched it off the table, his heart hammering as he answered. "Mark." Static. Then, "Doc, listen to me." Mark's voice was urgent low. "They know where you are." Dr. Emmanuel's blood turned to ice. "How?" Mark cursed under his breath. "They hacked into the adoption records. They found your connection to Joy through the system." Dr. Emmanuel's mind reeled. That meant this wasn't just a group of criminals. This was something bigger, more powerful. "How much time do we have?" he asked, already reaching for his keys. Mark's voice was grim. "None. Get out. Now." The escape plan. Dr. Emmanuel turned toward Lena, his body already moving. "They're coming," he said quickly. "We have to go." Lena didn't hesitate. She grabbed the small duffel bag they had packed the night before. Joy stood on the couch, eyes wide. "Eman." Her voice was small, uncertain. Dr. Emmanuel knelt in front of her. "Sweetheart, we have to go now, okay? But I promise I won't let anything happen to you." Joy stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. That was all he needed. He scooped her up in his arms, cradling her against his chest as he and Lena rushed toward the door. Then, a gunshot. The first attack. The bullet shattered the window behind them, sending shards of glass flying. Lena screamed. Dr. Emmanuel threw himself to the ground, shielding Joy with his body. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, footsteps. Slow, methodical. Whoever they were, they weren't in a hurry. They knew they had them trapped. Dr. Emmanuel's mind raced. They couldn't run out the front. The back door led into the forest, but with Joy in his arms, it wouldn't be easy to outrun armed men. "Lena," he hissed, "we need to go through the basement." She nodded frantically. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the wooden doorframe. No time. Dr. Emmanuel tightened his grip on Joy and sprinted toward the basement door, Lena right behind him. The moment they were inside, he slammed it shut, locking it. Joy was trembling in his arms. He pressed a hand against her back. "It's okay," he whispered. "I've got you." They had to find another way out. Fast. A desperate gamble. The basement was small, cluttered with storage boxes and old furniture, but in the farthest corner, a storm door. Their only exit. Dr. Emmanuel rushed toward it, fumbling with the lock. Outside, heavy footsteps thudded against the floor above them. They were coming. Come on," he muttered under his breath. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. A burst of cold air rushed inside. Lena grabbed his arm. "Go." Dr. Emmanuel didn't hesitate. He lifted Joy and ran. Through the forest. The moment they stepped outside, the world was a blur of movement. Branches whipped against his face as he ran, the wind howling in his ears. Behind them, a shout. Gunfire. He didn't stop. Didn't look back. Joy clung to him, her tiny hands gripping his shirt, her face buried in his chest. Lena ran beside him, breathing hard. The trees grew denser, the ground uneven beneath their feet. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The river's edge. They ran until the sound of gunfire faded into the distance, until the only sound was their ragged breathing. Then, water. Dr. Emmanuel skidded to a stop at the edge of a steep embankment. Below, a rushing river roared against jagged rocks. No way across. No way back. Lena's face paled. "We're trapped." Dr. Emmanuel turned, scanning the trees. He could hear them now. The men. Closing in. If they were caught, there would be no second chance. His mind raced. Then, he looked at Joy, at her wide, frightened eyes, at the way she trusted him completely. He took a deep breath and jumped into the unknown. The freezing water swallowed them whole. The world spun. Everything became weightless, breathless, a rushing void of icy darkness. Then, light. Dr. Emmanuel broke the surface, gasping for air. Joy was still in his arms, coughing but alive. Lena surfaced next, her eyes wild with shock. The current was strong. It carried them forward, away from the gunman, away from danger, into the unknown. The road ahead. By the time they dragged themselves onto the riverbank, the sky had begun to shift, the first hints of dawn streaking across the horizon. Dr. Emmanuel sat on the cold ground, cradling Joy in his arms. They had made it. For now. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Lena coughed, pushing wet hair from her face. What now? Dr. Emmanuel's jaw tightened. "We find them first." Lena frowned. "Find who?" He met her gaze, his expression steely. "The people who did this to her, the ones who had stolen Joy's life, the ones who had tried to take her back. Because this wasn't just about running anymore. It was about fighting back. For Joy. For the life she deserved. And Dr. Emmanuel Carter would not stop until every last one of them was brought down.